Okay, let's get into it. We have a really dense stack of sources today, all focused on one topic, constitutional theory. And this isn't just a dry political science lesson. It feels like a really systematic, even radical critique of how modern governments work.
That's a great way to put it. Our mission for this deep dive is to really pull out the essential pieces of what one theorist, Shrii Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, says makes an ideal constitution. We're going to be looking at a framework called the progressive utilization theory.
Yeah.
And just for our listeners, it's pronounced PROUT.
PROUT. Okay, got it. You know, we tend to think of a constitution as this almost sacred, unchangeable text, but we forget it's basically the ultimate rule book for the state, the most powerful institution there is. So why is this often, very dry guidebook so critical?
Well, the source material kicks off with a really stark warning. It says that the accumulation of power, which is what states do, is just incredibly dangerous if it isn't strictly guided by principle. This guidebook has to have codified rules, principles that guarantee all-round services for people's progress. If it's silent on core ethical or economic principles, you get systemic failure. You get exploitation.
So it's the guardrails. If the guide is meant to contain power, where did this whole idea of a written guide even begin?
This is where the history is just fascinating. The idea is way older than, say, the U.S. Constitution. According to these sources, the very first written constitution and also the first republican democracy was established in ancient India by the Licchavi Dynasty of Vaishali.
Wait, we're talking before classical Greece here, right?
Exactly, over 2,500 years ago. This republic was in an area of what's now Bihar, places like Muzaffarpur, Samastipur. And you have to understand, before this, the king's word was the law, period. So creating a written, codified democratic structure, it was revolutionary.
Imagine that. Creating a written republic when most of the world was ruled by absolute decree. Okay, let's fast forward. How do the sources compare modern systems? Specifically, the parliamentary versus the presidential models.
The differences are profound. You start with the British model, which is so unique because it's not one single document. It's a collection of traditions, of conventions. Formally, all power is with the crown, but in practice, the prime minister runs things. The sources do point out this interesting feature where if a ministry collapses, the crown can temporarily head what's called a lame duck ministry.
That's a huge reliance on tradition, a massive contrast to the United States.
Right. The U.S. model is, of course, written and presidential. The president is directly elected and governs through appointed secretaries. And the analysis we're looking at actually assesses the U.S. form as generally better than the parliamentary one, because the leader is directly elected by the people. There's more direct accountability.
And France kind of splits the difference.
It does. It's also presidential. But the president there has even more direct appointment power. They appoint the prime minister and all the other ministers. It's a bit different from the U.S. cabinet structure.
Which then brings us to India, which took the British parliamentary system. And the sources are, well, they're merciless in their critique.
They call it inherently flawed. The Indian president is described as little more than a rubber stamp, a signatory authority with no real power, can't even head a caretaker government. But the prime minister is extremely powerful, yet is not directly elected by the entire country.
They're just an MP from one constituency.
Exactly. And then they're made PM by their party. And here's the critical power imbalance. The PM can remove the president, but the president can't remove the PM. It centralizes all this power without a direct national mandate.
Okay, so let's swing back to the U.S. system. PROUT sees it as better than the parliamentary model, but it still has a huge foundational flaw, according to this analysis. What is it?
This is really the core philosophical argument. The sources say the U.S. system's biggest shortcoming is giving maximum scope to individual rights. And while that sounds great, the argument is that this priority will inevitably, always, lead to an unrestrained capitalist order.
Wow. I mean, that feels like a radical idea. For generations, individual liberty has been seen as the ultimate goal. How does PROUT make sure that its alternative, these social controls, don't just become, a tool for tyranny?
That is the essential question. And the answer is in the ethical foundation. Individual rights are subordinated to something the sources call cardinal human values.
Okay, let's pause there. We need to define that. What are cardinal human values in this framework?
They're universal moral principles. Things like nonviolence, truthfulness, ethical conduct. These are seen as taking precedence over any political or economic freedom. So the government has to enshrine these ethical lines first. If an individual's liberty conflicts with the welfare of the collective's interest has to come first.
So rights are conditional. They're judged against a higher moral baseline.
Precisely. PROUT would introduce these social controls to make sure that collective interests are supreme. And the economic piece of this is huge. The sources claim that all existing constitutions fail to guarantee one fundamental thing: increasing the purchasing power of every single individual. Without that guarantee, economic exploitation is basically constitutional.
That is a perfect transition. We've seen the philosophical critique of the U.S. system, so let's dig into the very specific, detailed example, the Indian Constitution, starting with the fiscal loopholes.
The sources list 4 big ones. First, unchecked exploitation. The argument is that the independence movement was only political anti-British. It wasn't economic. So after 1947, brown exploitation just replaced white exploitation. Unchecked capitalism was allowed to run wild.
Just swapping one exploiter for another.
Yes. Second is what we just mentioned: no guarantee of purchasing power. Third, the analysis says the Indian economy is controlled by a handful of business houses. Yet neither the president nor the PM has the constitutional power to check price levels or stop that exploitation. And fourth, there's just no provision for balanced economic planning across the country.
Those are massive economic critiques. Okay, now for the psychological loopholes, the things that hit at culture, identity, fairness. The first one is language imposition, or Hindi imperialism.
This point is so sharp, it shows how these foundational decisions can really undermine national unity. Imposing a regional language, Hindi as the official one, puts non-Hindi speakers at a huge disadvantage. It can relegate them to being B-class citizens because their native tongue isn't the one favored by the state.
And the detail here is just staggering. Hindi became the official language by a single vote from the chairman of the Constituent Assembly.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It just shows the fragility of it all. And the proposed alternative is quite radical. It suggests adopting Sanskrit, which is seen as the grandmother of most Indian languages.
Yeah.
And critically, using the Roman script, since Sanskrit doesn't have its own script. This avoids favoring any regional script.
The next psychological loophole is this code conflict, allowing Hindu law and Muslim law to exist side by side, which on its face violates the idea that everyone is equal before the law.
Right, and the analysis gives very clear examples. A Muslim man can have more than one wife. A Hindu man cannot. A Muslim man can divorce his wife without court approval. Hindu couples must go to court. It just creates different legal standards based on religion.
And the PROUT solution is a single, unified Indian code based on those cardinal human values we talked about.
Exactly. One law for everybody. The third defect is the absence of what's called neo-humanistic sentiment.
Okay, another term to define. What is neo-humanism?
It's an expansion of humanism. So traditional humanism focuses only on human welfare. Neo-humanism extends that ethical care to include all living beings and even inanimate nature. It's about recognizing the inherent value of all existence.
So how does the Constitution fail that principle?
By having no laws against the indiscriminate destruction of plants and animals. Humans destroy nature for, narrow selfish ends. And this disrupts what PROUT calls the cosmic family. So constitutional safeguards for flora and fauna are seen as essential.
That's a powerful ecological principle. What are the final defects the sources identify?
They're more administrative. First, a real ambiguity in the relationship between the central government and states, especially on the right of secession. And second, that the classification of scheduled tribes and castes is unscientific. It was done on racial lines instead of on the basis of economic and educational backwardness, which PROUT argues should be the only criteria.
So that's the diagnosis. Let's get to the cure. The PROUT agenda lays out very specific reforms. Let's start with balancing power.
The reforms would give the president real power, with checks. The president should be able to dissolve parliament under very specific, serious conditions, like a breakdown of law and order. But they have to explain their actions to parliament within a month. So there's transparency.
And to protect the document itself, it demands extreme constitutional rigidity.
Absolutely. The Constitution loses its status if it's changed all the time. So to make a fundamental amendment, parliament would need a staggering 78 majority. It's a huge hurdle designed to ensure only changes with massive consensus can pass.
Okay, here's one of the most provocative ones. The demand for high moral standards in leaders. The sources say the president and PM can't be divorced, marry a divorcee, or have more than one spouse. For listeners who find that really intrusive, how is that justified?
The justification is very direct. The theory argues that a leader who can't manage their personal life with integrity is fundamentally incapable of governing a nation with integrity. They have to be the living embodiment of those cardinal human values. If there's inconsistency in their private life, they're seen as lacking the moral foundation to be the guardian of the Constitution.
That is an incredibly high bar. What about the other legal and economic reforms?
Legally, all citizens must have equal rights. The law must be the same everywhere. The sources specifically call out things like special rights for Kashmiris to buy land, saying that has to end. Uniformity is key. Economically, a high-level review board, appointed by the president, has to constantly review economic progress. And if that board disagrees with Parliament, the Supreme Court has the final say. It institutionalizes economic justice at the highest level.
And finally, absolute accountability.
Yes, a case can be filed in the Supreme Court against anybody, including the PM and president. No one is above the law. And primary education must be guaranteed and totally free from political interference.
So if we pull the lens back, all of these national reforms, they really seem to be pointing toward the need for a world constitution.
That's the ultimate goal, yes.
Yep.
A world government guided by a world constitution. And that constitution has to have a global charter of rights. And that charter has 4 essential guarantees.
What are those for?
First, complete security for all plants and animals globally, the full neo-humanistic ideal. Second, guaranteed purchasing power for every citizen in every country. Third, 4 fundamental rights: spiritual practice, cultural legacy, education, and indigenous language.
And the 4th one is the ultimate safety valve, the final rule.
It's the overriding rule. If the practice of any of those rights conflicts with cardinal human values, that practice has to be stopped immediately. Cardinal human values take absolute precedence over everything else globally.
This has been an incredibly deep analysis, from the ancient Licchavi Republic all the way to a critique of modern economics and law. The PROUT framework is just astonishingly detailed.
It really is. And what the sources show is that constitutional defects are never just technical. They're fundamentally ethical. It runs from macroeconomics, guaranteeing purchasing power, all the way to ecology and safeguarding nature. The ideal constitution, from this perspective, isn't a political document. It's a moral one.
We've seen so many specific examples today that show how deeply personal and ethical the kraken of this document has to be. From the rule that leaders need moral character to that single vote that decided a national language. So as you think about all this, what stands out to you as a single most critical, non-negotiable principle that must be enshrined in any document that's meant to govern human progress? Something for you to mull over as you continue your own deep dive.